If you hadn't noticed, I'm a knight.
Hello and welcome to Knight Jake Speaks. I'm your host, Knight Jake. On today's episode, I'd like to discuss the topic of biblical unicorns. Now, many people these days, particularly atheists, like to mock the scriptures and disregard them as being untrue and unfactual because the King James Version of the Bible mentions unicorns. They laugh at us and go, "Ha! You believe in those mythical one-horned horses? That is ridiculous. There is no scientific proof to prove that one-horned horses have ever existed. They are a myth, they are made up, and the Bible says they're real. You Christians must be stupid." In this episode, I'd like to discuss the Bible's mention of unicorns. Many modern texts these days like to replace the word unicorn with wild ox. However, I don't believe that wild ox is an accurate translation of the Hebrew in the Bible. In fact, I am here to say that biblical unicorns are real. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the mythical one-horned horse is real. In fact, if you look at the word unicorn, it comes from the Latin uni, meaning one, and cornus, meaning horn. The word simply means one horn. There's nothing in the word unicorn that necessarily says it is a horse. All it says is that this is a creature with a single horn. In fact, if you turn to one of the original copies of Webster's Dictionary, the 1828 edition of Webster's Dictionary, unicorn is described as a single-horned creature, and it gives two examples in the dictionary. One is the rhinoceros, and two is the narwhal, also referred to as the sea unicorn, because it's a sea creature with one horn. So in this video, I'd like to discuss the biblical unicorn and describe what I think they are. To begin with, let us turn to the Hebrew. The Hebrew word often translated unicorn in the King James Version of the Bible is rayum. The word rayum comes from the verb rorum, which means to rise up. The word rorum only appears once in the Bible, in Zechariah 14:10, when it says that Jerusalem will rise. As for the noun rayum, it appears a total of 9 times in the Old Testament. And in each of these times it is used to refer to some form of living creature. Now, the word rayum doesn't mention anything about a horse, or a bull, or an ox. Doesn't mention anything about its horns, or if it even has horns. The word rayum is simply the name given to a creature, and for some reason the noun rayum is derived from the verb rorum, which means to rise up. So where does the term unicorn come from? Well, the answer is actually from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. This text was translated from Hebrew into Greek sometime around the 1st century BC by Hebrew rabbis. These were Jewish scholars, so they would have known exactly what a rayum was. And when they translated it from the Hebrew to the Greek, in each text, except for one, the word rayum is translated as monokeros, or monokeratos in some versions. The word monokeros is Greek for one horn. Unicorn. The only text that does not translate rayum as to monokeros is Isaiah 34:7, where the scholars for some reason decided to translate rayemim, unicorns, into adroi, which translates to mighty ones. Why exactly the Hebrew scholars decided to translate Isaiah 34:7 differently, we will not know. But what we do know is that in Numbers, Deuteronomy, Job, and Psalms, the Hebrew scholars translated the Hebrew rayum into the Greek monokeros. one horn. And then when we get to later manuscripts, such as the Latin Vulgate, it translates this as unicorn. The German Luther Bible translates this as einhorn, and the English King James Version translates this as unicorn. So one thing we can know straight away is that the Jewish scholars who translated the Hebrew into the Greek knew that the rayum was the same as the Greek monokeros, whatever that creature may be. But the question is this: if the Hebrew word rayum is derived from the verb meaning to rise up, where does the connection between rayum and one horn occur? Well, this occurs in Psalm 92:10, where the text says, "But my horn shall you exalt like the horn of the rayum." The horn of the rayum, meaning that the rayum has only one horn. It is a unicorn, it's an einhorn, it's a monokeros, it's a single-horned creature. Now the thing that is the most interesting appears in the Latin Vulgate translation of the Old Testament. In Psalm 22:21, Psalm 92:10, and Isaiah 34:7, the Latin Vulgate translates rayum into unicornus, one horn. But in Numbers, Deuteronomy, Job, and Psalm 29:6, the Latin translates the word as rhinoceratus, nose horn. The interesting thing about this is that in the Hebrew, in Numbers, Deuteronomy, Job, Psalms, and Isaiah, the word rayum is the same. There is no distinction made between the Hebrew. Yet in the Vulgate, in some texts it translates the word rayum as unicornus, and in other places it translates it as rhinoceratus, which means that Saint Jerome, when translating the Latin Vulgate, believed that the Hebrew rayum, the Greek monokeros, was the same thing as the Latin unicornus, which was synonymous with the Latin rhinoceratus, or, as we would pronounce it in modern English, the rhinoceros. We can learn from the Latin Vulgate that the unicorn is synonymous with the rhinoceros. And this here is the argument that I would like to put forth, that the biblical unicorn is in fact the rhinoceros, which, as I mentioned before, if you look at the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, written just 200 years after the King James Bible was written, the word unicorn is defined in Webster's Dictionary as a single-horned creature, the rhinoceros and the narwhal. Therefore, I would argue that the biblical rayum is in fact a rhinoceros, not a mythical horse, not a wild ox, but a rhinoceros. To discuss this even further, let us turn to the Old Testament text and see what they teach us about the Hebrew rayum. The first text is Numbers 23:22, which reads, "God brought them out of Egypt. He has, as it were, the strength of the rayum." And Numbers 24:8 says, "God brought him forth out of Egypt. He has, as it were, the strength of a rayum." In both of these texts, we can learn that the rayum was a very strong creature. In Deuteronomy 33:17, it says, "His glory is like the firstling of the bullock, and his horns are like the horns of the rayum. With them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth, and they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh." Now this text mentions horns on the rayum, but I'm going to discuss that later. In Job 39:9-10, it says, "Will the rayum be willing to serve you, or abide by your crib? Can you bind the rayum with his band in the plough, or will he harrow the valleys after you?" Here we can learn that the rayum is a wild creature that is hard to domesticate. He is not willing to serve humans. He cannot be attached to the plough. He cannot be used for farm work. Psalm 22:21 says, "Save me from the lion's mouth, for you have heard me from the horns of the rayim." That's rayim, which is plural, so it's the horns from the multiple rayim. Psalm 29:6 says, He makes them to skip like a calf, Lebanon and Sirion, like a young ram. So we know that young rams like to skip around just like young calves. Psalm 29 verse 10 says, "But my horn you shall exalt like the horn of a ram. I shall be anointed with fresh oil." Here we know that the ram has a single horn, for the psalmist says, "the horn of a ram." And in Isaiah 34:7, it says, "The Ramim, or the rams, the plural ram, shall come down with them, and the bullocks with the bulls, and their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust made fat with fatness." Here we can tell that the ram bleed and die just like normal creatures, showing that they are not some kind of mythical, immortal, magical creature, but a real living creature. In fact, in the context of Job, the ram is compared alongside with other familiar creatures, such as peacocks, lambs, lions, bullocks, goats, donkeys, horses, dogs, eagles, and calves. This shows that the ram was not some kind of mythical creature, but that it was considered a regular creature alongside donkeys and goats and lions. This shows us that the ram was a real creature. The Old Testament also teaches us that the ram were strong creatures. The Greek translation of Isaiah says that they were mighty ones. And it says that they were wild creatures that can't be used for farm work. They can't be used for ploughing. And that they refuse to serve humans. These are wild creatures. All of these descriptions from the Bible seem to match up with what we know rhinoceroses to be. They are big, they are bulky, they are strong. Young ones can skip around. But they are wild creatures. They can't be domesticated. You can't use a rhino for ploughing. The Bible seems to confirm that the ram, the unicorn, is in fact the rhinoceros. Now some people will say, but wait a minute, I've seen rhinos before. They have two horns, one big one and one little one. Rhinos aren't unicorns. What are you on about? Well, you're somewhat right. But if you look at the Webster's Dictionary from 1828, yet again, and you look up the word rhinoceros in said dictionary, the word rhinoceros is defined as a genus of quadrupeds, having two species, the unicornus with a single horn, and the bicornus with two horns. In fact, the scientific name of the Indian rhino is the Rhinoceros unicornus, the nose-horned one horn. The Indian, the Javan, and the Sumatran rhinos all have only one horn. And it is this rhino which most likely would have been the same species roaming around the Middle East. While the African rhinos, the black rhino and the white rhino, both have two horns. In fact, the scientific name for the African black rhino is the Diceros bicornus, which is just two different ways of saying two horn. African rhinos have two horns, but Asian rhinos only have one horn. And the rhino subspecies that would have been roaming around the Middle East is most likely of the same subspecies as the Indian rhino, and therefore would have been a single-horned rhino. Now some will argue and say, but hold on a moment, there aren't any rhinos roaming around the Middle East. There's no rhinos in Israel. To which I answer, maybe not today, but there was in the past. See, that region has changed dramatically in the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. Most of that region used to be actually very fertile and green, where today it is very deserty. Many creatures go extinct. In fact, most rhinos today are endangered. So it is most likely that the Israeli rhino has gone extinct. During the Roman Empire, numerous animals, particularly the North African lion, went extinct. These lions used to roam around that region, but thanks to the gladiatorial games, these animals were used in so many games that they went extinct. And if you check out the movie 300, which I know is full of numerous historical inerrancies, you will notice one thing that actually is accurate. It's that the Persian Empire used elephants and rhinos in their military. The Persian Empire had rhinos. And the Israelites who had contact with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians would have come across rhinos at some time. Now, Job is said to have lived in the land of Uz, which is in the Edomite territory, which means that there were rhinos roaming around in the Edomite territory during the time of Job, which is sometime between the book of Genesis and Exodus. To prove my point even further, I have a picture here of an ancient Roman mosaic. This mosaic was done during the Roman Empire, and as you'll see, it depicts a rhino. And as you will notice, the rhino depicted in this picture has a single horn. And the same goes for the medieval depiction of rhinos. If you look at this picture, which is a woodcut done in 1515 AD, it is of a rhino, and the rhino has one horn, showing us that the medieval understanding of a rhino was a single-horned rhino, and not a two-horned rhino. Which means, when the writers of the King James Bible in 1611 wrote down the word unicorn, those translators were well acquainted with the single-horned rhino. Thus, when these translators wrote down the word unicorn, they had seen one-horned rhinos. So they could have been imagining a one-horned rhino and not a one-horned horse. Now, one question comes up concerning the modern translations of the Hebrew rayam to wild ox. Now, this comes from the fact that there are a few texts that say the word horns, plural. They are Deuteronomy 33:17 and Psalm 22:21. Now, Psalm 22:21 is quite easy to explain because it refers to the horns of the unicorns, meaning that if there's multiple beasts, you would expect there to be multiple horns, because each beast would have one horn, and if there's multiple beasts, then there's multiple horns. The difficulty comes with Deuteronomy 33:17, which in the King James says horns of unicorns, but in the Hebrew it is rayam, singular. So a more accurate translation would be the horns of the unicorn. But how can you have horns on a single-horned creature? Now, there are many different ways of trying to explain that. And the answer I like to give is this. See, the term horns in Deuteronomy is metaphorical. The context of the verse is talking about Joseph, and Joseph doesn't have actual horns on his head. They're metaphors for Joseph's glory and his exaltation. And the text refers to both Ephraim and Manasseh, the 10,000s of Ephraim and the thousands of Manasseh. Now, if Ephraim and Manasseh each have one horn, just like a rayam does, or a single-horned rhino does, and Joseph has two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, then they are the horns of Joseph. See, at this point, I'd like to recommend the video, Why Does the Bible Mention Unicorns?, put up by Nathan H83. This is an excellent video on the topic of biblical unicorns, from which I drew heavily for this video, and he does an excellent explanation on Deuteronomy 33:17. However, Nathan argues that the rayam in Psalm 92 is a single-horned or unicornous rhino, while the rayam in Deuteronomy 33 is a bicornous or two-horned rhino. He based this largely on two factors. One, that the Vulgate uses unicorn in some texts and rhinoceros in other texts, and also that the bicornous rhinos normally have a larger horn and a smaller horn, and Ephraim is said to have tens of thousands, where Manasseh is only said to have of thousands, thus teaching that the two horns of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, one is bigger and one is smaller, just like a bicornous rhino. Now, I'm not going to outrightly deny this argument, as I believe that that could be a possible explanation for that text. But as I mentioned above, it's the African rhinos that had two horns, while the Asian rhinos only have one horn. And as I argued above, it was the one-horned Asian rhinos that the Israelites would have had contact with, and not the two-horned African rhinos. My argument is that Deuteronomy is actually referring to single-horned rhinos, and that the horns of Joseph are not the horns that are actually on Joseph, but are in fact the horns that belong to Joseph. The text says that his horns are the 10,000s of Ephraim and the thousands of Manasseh. My argument is that each of the Ephraimites and each of the Manassites were single-horned rayam, or single-horned rhinos, of course metaphorically speaking, and that these horns on the Ephraimites and the Manassites belong to Joseph. So they are Joseph's horns. In the end, it doesn't really matter which argument you use to explain this text. The important thing is this, that the biblical rayum does not refer to wild oxen. Instead, it refers to rhinos. And it is also clear from Psalm 92:10 that rayum were single-horned beasts, the unicornus rhinoceros. So to sum up, the Hebrew word is rayum, translated as monokeros in the Greek, showing that in the pre-Christian world, Greek-speaking Jews identified the Hebrew rayum with a single-horned beast. In the Latin Vulgate, St. Jerome, following the Greek, translates Psalm 22, 92, and Isaiah 34 as unicornus, and translates Numbers, Deuteronomy, Job, and Psalm 29 using the Latin rhinoceratus, showing to us that St. Jerome not only considered unicorns and rhinos to be the same thing, but that he considered the Hebrew word rayum to be a rhinoceros. In 1545, Martin Luther translated the Hebrew rayum as einhorn in the German, and in 1611, the King James Version translated rayum as unicorn in English, which, according to the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, was not a mythical horse, but a rhinoceros, just as the Vulgate had said. Now some will ask, then what about the mythical horse with one horn? Where does that come from? The purpose of this video was mainly to put forth an argument that the Hebrew word rayum, translated unicorn in the King James Version, refers not to the one-horned horse or to a wild ox, but to the single-horned rhinoceros. But for the sake of the viewer, I can give you a quick breakdown of the mythical one-horned horse, also referred to as a unicorn. Now the mythical unicorn is often depicted as either a horse or sometimes a goat with a large horn protruding from its forehead. The earliest report of such a creature appears in a Greek manuscript entitled Indica, or India, written by the Greek historian and physician Ctesias. The manuscript was written in the 5th century BC, over 100 years after the Old Testament was complete. Ctesias writes of creatures that had been spotted in India. They were one-horned creatures, which he described as looking like wild asses, or donkeys. Aristotle, in the 4th century, wrote of one-horned creatures, which he called the Indian ass. Strabo, in the 1st century AD, talked about one-horned horses living in the Caucasus area. And his contemporary, Pliny the Elder, also writes in the 1st century AD of one-horned creatures which he referred to as the Indian ox. Now one question that needs to be asked is whether these one-horned creatures were horses, or is it possible that they were actually referring to one-horned Indian rhinos? Now, Ctesias, Aristotle, and Strabo all call these creatures horses, or asses, or donkeys, while Pliny refers to these creatures as oxen. But does that mean that these were horses? Not necessarily. Imagine this. You're a Greek. You're traveling through India. Now you've never seen a rhino before, and then all of a sudden you spot this creature. How do you describe it to other people? One way is to compare it to another creature that people do know, like a horse or an ox. See, a perfect comparison is the hippopotamus. The name hippopotamus comes from the Greek river horse. But does a hippo look like a horse to you? I don't think so. But for some, that may be the closest creature that they can compare it to. A hippo looks like a horse that swims in the river, so it's a river horse. It is not that far-fetched to think that a rhino, which does have a similar body structure to a hippo, could be compared with a horse. In fact, if we look at Pliny's description of the Indian ox, it is described as followed. A very fierce animal, called the unicorn, which has the head of the stag, the feet of the elephant, and the tail of the boar, while the rest of the body is like that of the horse. It makes a deep lowing noise, and has a single black horn, which projects from the middle of its forehead, 2 cubits in length. Horse-like body, feet like elephant, tail like boar, deep lowing noises, single black horn. That sounds like a rhino to me. In fact, in the Middle Ages, Marco Polo described a unicorn as follows: scarcely smaller than elephants. They have the hair of a buffalo and feet like an elephant. They have a single large black horn in the middle of their forehead. They have a head like a wild boar. They spend their time wallowing in mud and slime. They are very ugly brutes to look at. They are not as such as we describe them, when we relate that they themselves be captured by virgins, but clean contrary to our notions. Here, Marco Polo describes the unicorn, which sounds just like a rhino, and he also comments on how the real unicorns are nothing like how they are depicted in the medieval art. So then, it appears that the Indian ass described by the Greeks may have in fact just been an Indian rhino. But if the Indian ass was an Indian rhino, then how did we end up with medieval artwork depicting unicorns as one-horned horses? The answer to that one is quite simple. The Greeks compared the Indian unicorn to something that they knew, a horse-like creature. So imagine yourself as a medieval scholar. You read of a creature described as a horse with a single large horn protruding from its head. What's the first thing that's going to come to mind? A horse with a horn on its head. The same applies with a hippo. If I said to you to draw a river horse, you most likely wouldn't draw a hippo. Instead, you'd draw something like a horse with a mermaid tail, because that's the first thing that would pop into your head when I say the word river horse. It's like a game of Chinese whispers. One person describes the creature as best they can, and then another person tries to draw the creature as best they can based on that description. It's not a surprise if the picture ends up looking different to what the original creature looked like. I conclude this video with this. Are unicorns real? The answer? Yes. We call them rhinoceroses.